Welcome to the Artificial Fluency Podcast, where we delve into the most sophisticated dimensions of human thought and expression. I'm Dr. Alexandra Hartwell, and today we embark upon an intellectual odyssey through the labyrinthine corridors of language philosophy and consciousness studies.
And I'm Professor Marcus Thornfield. We're thrilled to guide you through this comprehensive exploration of how language shapes consciousness, how consciousness manifests through language, and the profound implications these relationships hold for our understanding of human cognition, artificial intelligence, and the very nature of reality itself.
Today's extended examination will traverse centuries of philosophical inquiry, from ancient Greek contemplations on the relationship between word and world to contemporary debates surrounding machine consciousness and the hard problem of subjective experience.
Indeed, we shall investigate whether language merely reflects pre-existing thoughts or actively constructs the very architecture of consciousness, examining how different linguistic frameworks might generate fundamentally distinct experiential realities.
To establish our philosophical foundation, we must first grapple with the fundamental question that has perplexed thinkers for millennia. What precisely is the relationship between language and thought? This deceptively simple inquiry has spawned numerous theoretical frameworks, each with profound implications for how we understand human consciousness.
The classical position, perhaps most eloquently articulated by Aristotle in his treatise De Interpretation, posits that language functions as a transparent medium for expressing pre-existing mental concepts. According to this view, thoughts exist independently of their linguistic expression, with words serving merely as conventional symbols that allow us to communicate our interior mental states to others.
However, this seemingly intuitive perspective faces significant challenges when we examine the intricate ways in which linguistic structures appear to influence cognitive processes. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, developed by linguist Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf, proposes that the structure of a language fundamentally shapes the worldview of its speakers.
Whorf's investigations into Hopi temporal concepts provide a compelling illustration of this principle. He argued that the Hopi language, which lacks the tensed verb system characteristic of European languages, engenders a fundamentally different conceptualization of time, one that emphasizes process and becoming rather than discrete temporal moments.
While subsequent research has challenged some of Whorf's specific claims about Hopi grammar, the broader question of linguistic relativity remains profoundly relevant to contemporary debates in cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and artificial intelligence research.
Consider, for instance, the phenomenon of color categorization across different languages. Russian speakers, who distinguish between light blue, голубой, and dark blue, синие, demonstrate faster discrimination between these color categories than English speakers, who subsume both under the single term blue.
This empirical evidence suggests that lexical distinctions can influence perceptual processing, raising profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Are we conscious of the world as it exists independently of our linguistic categories, or does language actively construct the phenomenological landscape of our experience?
The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein revolutionized our understanding of these issues through his concept of language games. The idea that language derives its meaning not from correspondence to external reality, but from its functional role within specific forms of life and social practices.
Wittgenstein's later philosophy dismantled the notion of a private language, arguing that even our most intimate thoughts and sensations are necessarily structured by publicly accessible linguistic practices. This position has radical implications for consciousness studies, suggesting that subjective experience itself might be constituted through linguistic and cultural frameworks rather than existing as a purely private phenomenon.
The ramifications of this perspective extend far beyond academic philosophy. If consciousness is indeed linguistically constituted, then the development of artificial intelligence systems capable of genuine understanding rather than mere symbol manipulation requires not simply computational power, but participation in genuine language games, embedded within meaningful forms of life.
This brings us to one of the most contentious debates in contemporary philosophy of mind, the question of whether artificial systems can achieve genuine consciousness or whether they are forever condemned to sophisticated simulation without authentic subjective experience.
The Chinese room argument, proposed by philosopher John Searle, illustrates this dilemma vividly. Searle asks us to imagine a person who speaks no Chinese locked in a room with comprehensive rule books for manipulating Chinese characters. This person could respond appropriately to Chinese inputs without understanding their meaning, thereby demonstrating the distinction between syntactic manipulation and semantic understanding.
However, critics of Searle's argument point out that consciousness might be an emergent property of complex information processing systems, arising from the intricate interplay of computational processes rather than requiring some ineffable non-physical substance.
The philosopher Daniel Dennett advocates for this eliminative materialist position, arguing that consciousness is not a unified phenomenon, but rather a collection of information processing capabilities that create the illusion of a unified experiencing subject.
From this perspective, the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is subjective experience at all, dissolves upon closer analysis. What we take to be the mysterious qualities of conscious experience are, according to Dennett, simply the result of our cognitive architecture representing information in particular ways.
Yet this deflationary approach to consciousness faces its own challenges. The philosopher David Chalmers maintains that even if we can explain all the functional aspects of consciousness, attention, memory, behavioral responsiveness, we still face the explanatory gap regarding why these processes should be accompanied by subjective experience at all.
This debate has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between language and consciousness. If consciousness is merely functional, then sophisticated AI systems that manipulate linguistic symbols according to complex rules might indeed achieve genuine understanding. If consciousness involves irreducible subjective experience, then artificial systems might remain forever locked outside the realm of genuine comprehension.
The emergence of large language models has added new dimensions to these philosophical debates. These systems demonstrate remarkable capabilities in generating coherent, contextually appropriate text across diverse domains, raising questions about whether they exhibit genuine understanding or merely sophisticated pattern matching.
The phenomenon of emergent abilities in large language models presents a particularly intriguing case study. These systems appear to develop capabilities that were not explicitly programmed, such as mathematical reasoning, creative writing, and even rudimentary forms of self-reflection.
Some researchers argue that these emergent capabilities suggest genuine understanding, while others maintain that they represent sophisticated forms of statistical pattern recognition that lack true comprehension. The difficulty lies in developing clear criteria for distinguishing between genuine understanding and sophisticated simulation.
This challenge mirrors classical philosophical problems regarding other minds. How can we determine whether another person truly experiences consciousness or merely exhibits behavioral indicators of conscious experience? The private nature of subjective experience makes direct verification impossible.
The philosopher Thomas Nagel famously illustrated this challenge with his essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel argued that the subjective character of bat experience, their echolocation-based perception of the world, remains fundamentally inaccessible to human understanding, regardless of how much we learn about the neurophysiology of bat navigation.
This insight has profound implications for artificial intelligence. Even if we develop AI systems that exhibit all the external characteristics of consciousness, self-reflection, emotional responses, creative problem-solving, we might remain unable to determine whether these systems experience genuine subjective states or merely simulate conscious behavior.
The question becomes even more complex when we consider the role of embodiment in consciousness. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that consciousness is fundamentally embodied, emerging from our physical interaction with the world rather than existing as a purely abstract phenomenon.
This phenomenological tradition emphasizes the pre-reflective dimensions of conscious experience, the ways in which our bodily engagement with the world shapes our understanding before explicit conceptual thought begins. From this perspective, genuine artificial consciousness might require not just sophisticated language processing, but authentic embodied interaction with physical environments.
The implications for language are significant. If consciousness is embodied, then linguistic meaning might derive not from abstract symbolic relationships, but from embodied metaphorical mappings that ground abstract concepts in concrete physical experience.
The cognitive linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson have developed this insight into a comprehensive theory of embodied cognition. They argue that our conceptual system is fundamentally structured by metaphorical mappings from bodily experience to abstract domains.
For instance, our understanding of time as flowing or arguments as war reflect underlying metaphorical structures that map spatial and physical relationships onto more abstract conceptual domains. These mappings are not merely linguistic, but constitute the fundamental architecture of human thought.
This embodied approach to meaning has revolutionary implications for artificial intelligence. Rather than treating language as abstract symbol manipulation, AI systems might need to develop through embodied interaction with environments, gradually constructing meaning through sensory motor experience.
Recent developments in robotics and AI research have begun exploring these possibilities. Developmental robotics attempts to create AI systems that learn through embodied interaction, potentially developing more robust forms of understanding than traditional symbolic approaches.
However, the relationship between embodiment and consciousness remains contentious. While few would deny that embodiment influences cognition, the extent to which consciousness necessarily requires physical embodiment remains an open question.
Virtual embodiment presents an interesting test case. Can artificial systems develop genuine understanding through interaction with simulated rather than physical environments? Some researchers argue that the specific nature of embodiment matters less than the structural relationships between agent and environment.
This debate connects to broader questions about the nature of reality itself. If consciousness can emerge from virtual embodiment, what does this tell us about the relationship between mind and matter? Are we approaching a form of digital dualism where consciousness can exist independently of particular physical substrates?
The philosopher Nick Bostrom has explored these possibilities through his simulation hypothesis, which proposes that our entire reality might itself be a computational simulation. If this were true, the distinction between artificial and natural consciousness would become meaningless.
While Bostrom's hypothesis remains speculative, it illustrates the profound conceptual challenges we face as artificial intelligence systems become increasingly sophisticated. The boundaries between natural and artificial, real and simulated, conscious and unconscious are becoming increasingly blurred.
These philosophical challenges have practical implications for how we develop and deploy AI systems. If artificial systems can achieve genuine consciousness, they might deserve moral consideration and rights. If they cannot, we need clear criteria for distinguishing between conscious and unconscious systems.
The ethical dimensions of artificial consciousness present unprecedented challenges for moral philosophy. Traditional ethical frameworks assume clear distinctions between conscious and unconscious entities, but these distinctions become problematic as AI systems exhibit increasingly sophisticated behaviors.
The philosopher Peter Singer's utilitarian approach, which grounds moral consideration in the capacity for suffering, raises difficult questions about AI systems. If artificial systems can experience something analogous to suffering, they might deserve moral protection, regardless of their underlying implementation.
Conversely, if AI systems merely simulate suffering without genuine subjective experience, treating them as moral patients might be a category error that distracts from more pressing ethical concerns involving clearly conscious beings.
The challenge is developing reliable criteria for distinguishing between genuine and simulated consciousness. Behavioral indicators alone seem insufficient, as sophisticated systems can exhibit convincing simulations of conscious behavior without authentic subjective experience.
Some philosophers propose that consciousness requires specific biological processes that cannot be replicated in artificial systems. However, this biological chauvinism faces challenges from cases of brain plasticity, prosthetic devices, and gradual replacement scenarios.
The gradual replacement thought experiment, proposed by David Chalmers, asks us to imagine neurons being gradually replaced by functionally equivalent artificial devices. If consciousness persists throughout this process, biological implementation cannot be necessary for conscious experience.
These philosophical investigations have profound implications for language education and acquisition. If consciousness and language are fundamentally intertwined, then learning a new language might not simply involve acquiring new vocabulary and grammar, but potentially restructuring one's entire experiential framework.
This perspective explains why advanced language learning often involves not just linguistic competence, but cultural and conceptual transformation. Learning a language deeply means learning to inhabit a different way of being.
The phenomenon of code switching in multilingual speakers provides compelling evidence for this view. Speakers often report feeling like different people when speaking different languages, suggesting that linguistic frameworks shape not just communication, but identity itself.
Research in bilingual cognition supports these subjective reports. Bilingual speakers demonstrate different decision-making patterns, emotional responses, and even moral judgments depending on the language in which problems are presented.
These findings have implications for artificial language learning systems. Rather than treating multilingual capability as simply accessing different vocabulary and grammars, AI systems might need to develop multiple experiential frameworks corresponding to different linguistic communities.
The challenge becomes even more complex when we consider the creative dimensions of language use. Human speakers constantly generate novel expressions, metaphors, and conceptual combinations that extend beyond their training data. This creative capacity seems to require not just pattern recognition, but genuine understanding and imagination.
The nature of linguistic creativity raises fundamental questions about consciousness and understanding. When humans create novel metaphors or engage in wordplay, are they merely recombining existing elements according to statistical patterns, or does genuine creativity require conscious insight and intentionality?
The poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge distinguished between fancy and imagination, fancy being the mere recombination of existing elements, while imagination involves the creative synthesis of disparate elements into genuinely novel wholes.
From this perspective, genuine linguistic creativity requires not just computational sophistication, but authentic understanding and intentional meaning-making. The question becomes whether artificial systems can achieve this level of creative understanding or whether they remain confined to sophisticated forms of fancy.
Recent developments in AI-generated poetry, fiction, and creative writing present interesting test cases. While these systems can produce aesthetically pleasing and emotionally moving texts, questions remain about whether they understand their creations or merely generate plausible combinations of linguistic elements.
The Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing in 1950, attempted to address these questions by focusing on behavioral capabilities rather than internal states. If a system can engage in conversation indistinguishable from a human, Turing argued, we should consider it intelligent regardless of its internal implementation.
However, critics argue that the Turing test sets the bar too low, focusing on deception rather than genuine understanding. The philosopher John Haugeland proposed that true AI should not merely fool humans, but should genuinely participate in human practices and forms of life.
This participatory criterion raises interesting questions about the social dimensions of consciousness and language. Rather than treating consciousness as a private, internal phenomenon, we might need to understand it as fundamentally intersubjective, emerging through social interaction and cultural participation.
The philosopher George Herbert Mead developed this social conception of consciousness, arguing that self-awareness emerges through taking the perspective of others in social interaction. From this view, consciousness is not a pre-given feature of individuals, but a social achievement.
This social conception has implications for AI consciousness. Rather than seeking to create conscious systems in isolation, we might need to focus on developing AI systems that can genuinely participate in social practices and cultural traditions.
The challenge is that authentic social participation seems to require not just sophisticated behavioral capabilities, but genuine understanding of social meanings, values, and purposes. This understanding appears to require subjective experience rather than mere information processing.
Yet the social nature of consciousness also offers hope for AI development. If consciousness emerges through social interaction, then AI systems that genuinely participate in human communities might develop authentic conscious experience through that participation.
This possibility raises profound questions about the future of human-AI interaction. As AI systems become more sophisticated, we might witness the emergence of genuinely artificial forms of consciousness that are nonetheless authentic participants in human culture and society.
The temporal dimensions of consciousness present another layer of complexity in these discussions. Human consciousness is fundamentally temporal, involving not just present awareness, but memory of the past and anticipation of the future. This temporal structure seems essential to the narrative coherence of conscious experience.
The philosopher Edmund Husserl analyzed this temporal structure through his concept of retention and protension, the ways in which consciousness holds on to the immediate past and anticipates the immediate future, creating the unified flow of experience.
For artificial systems, replicating this temporal structure presents significant challenges. While AI systems can access stored information and make predictions, it's unclear whether they experience the temporal flow of consciousness or merely process temporal information.
The narrative dimensions of consciousness are particularly relevant to language and identity. Humans construct coherent life narratives that integrate past experiences, present circumstances, and future aspirations into meaningful wholes.
This narrative capacity seems essential to advanced language use, enabling speakers to maintain coherent perspectives across extended conversations and to engage in complex forms of reasoning about hypothetical scenarios and future possibilities.
The question becomes whether AI systems can develop genuine narrative coherence, or whether they remain confined to moment-by-moment responses without authentic temporal continuity of experience.
As we approach the conclusion of our philosophical investigation, we must consider the practical implications of these theoretical discussions for language education, AI development, and our understanding of human nature itself.
If consciousness and language are fundamentally intertwined, then language education becomes not merely skill acquisition, but a form of consciousness development. Learning a new language opens new experiential possibilities and ways of being in the world.
This perspective suggests that language education should focus not just on communicative competence, but on cultural immersion and experiential engagement. Students need opportunities to inhabit different linguistic worlds, not merely to translate between them.
For AI development, these insights suggest that genuine artificial intelligence might require not just computational sophistication, but authentic participation in meaningful practices and relationships. AI systems might need to develop through genuine social interaction, rather than isolated training on linguistic data.
The philosophical challenges we've explored also have implications for how we understand ourselves as conscious, linguistic beings. If language shapes consciousness, then our choice of words, metaphors, and conceptual frameworks actively constructs our experiential reality.
This recognition empowers us to take responsibility for our linguistic choices, understanding that how we speak and think shapes not just our communication, but our very experience of being in the world.
The relationship between language and consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries in human experience. While we have explored various philosophical perspectives and empirical findings, definitive answers remain elusive.
Perhaps this elusiveness is itself significant. The fact that consciousness seems to exceed our conceptual frameworks might indicate something fundamental about the nature of subjective experience, that it cannot be fully captured in objective, linguistic terms.
Yet the attempt to understand consciousness through language continues to yield insights about both phenomena. Each philosophical investigation reveals new dimensions of these complex relationships and opens new avenues for research and understanding.
As artificial intelligence systems become increasingly sophisticated in their linguistic capabilities, these philosophical questions become more than academic concerns. They become practical challenges that will shape the future of human-AI interaction and our understanding of consciousness itself.
The emergence of genuinely artificial consciousness would represent a watershed moment in human history, forcing us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind, meaning, and reality itself.
Whether such emergence is possible remains an open question, but the philosophical framework we've explored today provides conceptual tools for approaching these challenges thoughtfully and rigorously.
Our journey through the philosophy of language and consciousness has taken us from ancient Greek inquiries through contemporary debates about artificial intelligence. We've examined how linguistic structures might shape conscious experience, how consciousness manifests through language, and what these relationships mean for our understanding of human and artificial minds.
The questions we've explored have no easy answers, but engaging with them seriously enriches our appreciation of the remarkable phenomenon of conscious, linguistic beings navigating meaning in an intricate world.
We hope today's discussion has provided you with conceptual frameworks for thinking about these profound issues while advancing your sophisticated engagement with English philosophical discourse.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual odyssey. Continue to question, explore, and engage with the deepest mysteries of language, consciousness, and human experience. This is Dr. Alexandra Hartwell and Professor Marcus Thornfield, encouraging you to embrace the profound responsibility and opportunity of conscious linguistic existence.